Hey there, thrill seekers. Ready to set sail into the deep, dark unknown? Tonight, we're diving into 5 true, unnerving cruise ship horror stories. Real-life nightmares that prove the open sea isn't all sunshine and cocktails. Ghostly whispers, eerie disappearances, and things that go bump in the night. You'll never look at a cruise the same way again. Buckle up, it's about to get chilling. And hey, if you survive the ride, hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Story number 1 by Samuel. They say the sea doesn't forget. I used to think that was just an old sailor's tale, the kind of thing you hear in ports or over pints in dim-lit pubs. But after what I experienced, I've started to wonder if it's not the sea remembering, but the people it's taken. This story isn't something I've told often, not because it's unbelievable, but because it stays with me. You'll see what I mean. It was 1997. I was on a backpacking trip across Europe, starting in London and making my way south along the coast. By the time I reached Plymouth, my funds were low, and I was looking for cheap lodgings and a warm place to spend the night. That's how I found myself in the Fisherman's Arms, a snug little pub on Lambhay Hill. The place felt like it had stories soaked into its walls. Old photos of fishing boats and naval ships hung unevenly, their frames dusty but their tails intact. The air smelled of salt, spilled beer, and fried fish, and the chatter of locals blended with the occasional creak of the floorboards. I was nursing a pint at the bar, trying to decide whether to push further down the coast or settle in Plymouth for a few days, when I overheard an older man talking at the next table. He had a weathered face, the kind that spoke of years at sea. His voice carried that mix of authority and weariness you only get after decades in uniform. "Never found her, you know," he said, tapping his glass with a calloused finger. "Vanished like smoke. One minute she was there, next, gone." Curiosity got the better of me. I turned in my stool and asked, "What was gone?" The man looked at me, then at my half-empty glass. "Buy me a pint and I'll tell you," he said with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. And that's how I met Richard McAllister, a retired Royal Navy officer with more stories than he had years left. He started slow, setting the scene like a storyteller who knew his audience wasn't going anywhere. "It was 1968, he began. "I was a young lieutenant assigned to the HMS Roderick. We were patrolling the channel, routine stuff mostly, when we got a distress call from a small cargo ship off the coast of Cornwall. She was called the Stella Maris. A storm had rolled in, fierce enough to make seasoned sailors rethink their careers, and they were taking on water fast." He paused to take a sip of his beer. "By the time we reached her coordinates, the storm had passed, but there was no sign of the Stella Maris, not a plank, not a barrel, nothing. Just calm seas and a fading signal on our radios." I frowned. "Couldn't she have sunk?" "Of course she could have," Richard said, leaning closer. "Ships sink all the time. But this wasn't normal. For weeks after, sailors in the area reported strange things, lights on the water, voices calling out in the night. Some even claimed to see the Stella Maris herself, battered and listing but still afloat, as if caught between the world of the living and the dead." He leaned back, watching my reaction. I couldn't tell if he was testing me or just enjoying the telling of the tale. "That's not the end of it, though," he continued. "Years later, in '85, I was in command of a small patrol ship, the HMS Breakwater. We were running drills near the Isles of Scilly when we picked up an old, faint distress signal on the radio. Same frequency as the one from '68. It was the Stella Maris." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Did you find her?" Richard shook his head. "No, but we weren't alone out there that night. My crew, men I trusted with my life, started seeing things. Shapes in the fog, figures standing on the waves. One of my officers swore he saw a woman in a torn dress on the bow of a phantom ship staring right at him. When he tried to get a closer look, he slipped and nearly went overboard." He rubbed his temples as if the memory still weighed on him. "I don't know what we saw out there, but it wasn't the Stella Maris, not anymore. Whatever she became after that storm, it wasn't natural." Richard finished his beer and set the glass down with a soft thud. "Or maybe she's just looking for someone to remember her. Someone who'll listen to the whispers of what happened that night." Richard's words hung in the air like smoke, swirling and heavy. For a moment, the warmth of the pub faded, replaced by the imagined chill of open water and endless fog. I wasn't sure how much to believe. Was this an old sailor spinning tales for a free drink, or was there truth hidden in his words? Either way, I couldn't shake the unease I felt. "You ever go back?" I asked. He looked at me, his eyes sharp despite the lines around them. "No, some things you leave to the sea." I didn't see Richard again after that night. He left the pub shortly after our conversation, walking out into the misty Plymouth air with the deliberate steps of a man who'd learned not to look back. But his story stayed with me. I kept traveling along the coast, eventually making my way to Cornwall. By then, I was telling myself I just wanted to see the sights, but deep down, I knew better. I was looking for something, or maybe waiting for something to find me. One gray afternoon, I found myself in Falmouth, wandering the docks and talking to fishermen. It didn't take long before someone mentioned the Stella Maris. "Ah, her," said an older man named Peter, his accent thick and salty as the air around him. "Every sailor round here's heard of her. She's bad luck, that one, a ghost ship, plain and simple." "Have you ever seen her?" I asked. Peter hesitated, his weathered hands gripping the edge of his boat. "Once," he said, "years ago, during a fog so thick you couldn't see your own bow. I was out near the Manacles, treacherous waters those, when I saw her lights. Thought it was another fishing boat at first, but she didn't move like one. Too slow, too deliberate. And then," he trailed off, his eyes distant. "And then what?" I pressed. "She was gone," he said, shaking his head. "Vanished like she was never there, but the voices, those stayed. Faint like whispers carried on the wind. I couldn't let it go. That night I rented a small boat from a skeptical harbor master who only agreed because I paid him in cash and promised to return it by dawn. Equipped with a flashlight, a compass, and a flask of whiskey for courage, I set out toward the area Richard and Peter had mentioned, the waters near the Manacles. The sea was calm at first, the stars overhead faint but steady. I followed the coastline until I reached the dark silhouette of the rocks, jagged teeth rising from the water. The Manacles had claimed dozens of ships over the centuries, their remains scattered across the seabed like forgotten gravestones. I killed the engine, letting the boat drift. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the occasional slap of water against the hull. And then I heard it, a faint crackle like static from an old radio, followed by a voice, soft, indistinct, but unmistakably human. I grabbed the flashlight and swept it across the water, my heart pounding. "Hello?" I called out, my voice swallowed by the vastness of the night. No answer. Just the faint crackle, growing louder now, interspersed with snatches of words I couldn't quite make out. It sounded like a distress call, but it wasn't coming from my radio. It was in the air, everywhere and nowhere at once. Then I saw the lights. They were dim, flickering like lanterns swaying in the wind, but they were there. 2 of them, glowing faintly through the mist that had crept in around me. They moved slowly, bobbing in the darkness like a ship's running lights. "Stella Maris," I whispered, my breath visible in the cold air. The lights grew closer, and for a moment, I thought I saw the outline of a ship, a ghostly silhouette, its masts broken and its hull scarred by time and tides. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, leaving only the lights and the whispers. I should have been terrified, but instead, I felt calm, like the sea itself was holding its breath, waiting. "Who's there?" I asked again, my voice steady despite the trembling in my hands. The whispers faded, replaced by something else, a single, haunting melody, soft and sorrowful. It was a woman's voice, singing in a language I didn't recognize. The sound wrapped around me, filling the air with an aching sense of loss. And then the lights began to fade. "Wait!" I shouted, standing up in the boat. "Don't go." But they were already gone, swallowed by the mist. The melody lingered for a moment longer, then disappeared, leaving only the sound of the waves. I returned to the harbor at dawn, exhausted and shaken. The harbor master gave me a look that said he knew better than to ask questions, and I didn't offer any answers. I spent the next few days trying to make sense of what I'd experienced. Maybe it was my imagination, fueled by Richard's story and Peter's warnings. Maybe it was just the tricks of the sea, lights and sounds bending through the mist. But deep down, I knew better. The Stella Maris wasn't just a story. She was out there, lost but not forgotten, her crew trapped in a liminal space between life and death. And for one brief moment, I had been part of her story too. To this day, I can't look at the ocean the same way. I see her in every patch of fog, every distant light on the water. And sometimes, late at night, I hear that melody, the song of the Stella Maris calling me back to the sea. Story number 2 by Alexander. The ocean is many things, vast, mysterious, full of life, but it is never empty. Even when it looks like an endless stretch of blue, something stirs beneath its surface. And sometimes those things rise up, not to be seen, but to remind us that they are still there. I didn't believe this until it happened to me. It was 2018 when I found myself on the Ocean Whisperer, a mid-sized cruise ship sailing the Mediterranean. I wasn't looking for a vacation, really. I've never been much for beachside loungers or buffet lines. But I'd been talked into it by a friend, Alex, who had a knack for making every adventure sound irresistible. "Come on," he'd said, grinning as he waved the brochure in my face. "You can't pass up sunsets on the Aegean. It's practically therapy." So there I was, somewhere between Greece and Italy, watching the sun dip into the horizon, wondering if this whole cruise thing might grow on me after all. The Ocean Whisperer was an old ship, refurbished in the early 2000s but still bearing signs of its age. Creaky rails, occasional flickering lights, and the faint scent of seawater that never quite left the lower decks. But it had charm. The crew was friendly, the itinerary packed with postcard-worthy stops, and the open sea stretched endlessly in every direction. On the third night, I was out on the upper deck, nursing a drink and soaking in the quiet. Most of the passengers were inside, enjoying the evening show. A magic act, I think. I wasn't much for crowds, so I'd found myself drawn to the solitude of the open deck. That's when I noticed him. A young deckhand, probably in his early 20s, was leaning against the railing a few meters away. His uniform was rumpled, and he seemed lost in thought, staring out at the dark water. Something about his posture caught my attention. It wasn't the casual ease of someone taking a break. It was tense, like he was waiting for something. I'm not one to strike up random conversations, but there was a pull in the air that night, a weight that made silence feel heavier than words. "Quiet out here," I said, raising my glass slightly in a gesture of camaraderie. He didn't turn. "It always is," he replied, his voice low and distant. I waited for him to elaborate, but he didn't. Instead, he turned and walked away, his footsteps barely audible against the wooden deck. The next morning, I was up early hoping to catch the sunrise. I made my way to the bow where the sea stretched out like an endless canvas of silver and gold. I wasn't alone. A few passengers were scattered about, cameras in hand, but the mood was serene. Then I overheard 2 crew members talking nearby, their voices hushed but urgent. "Can't find him anywhere," one said, a tall man with a thick accent I couldn't quite place. "Check the lower decks?" the other asked. "Everywhere. It's like he just disappeared." My stomach tightened. I didn't know who they were talking about, but I couldn't help thinking of the deckhand from the night before. At breakfast, the captain made an announcement. One of the crew members was missing, and a full search was underway. Passengers were asked to remain calm and stay out of restricted areas while the investigation continued. The dining room buzzed with speculation. Some people thought he'd fallen overboard. Others whispered about foul play. But no one seemed to notice the unease in the crew, the way they avoided each other's eyes and spoke in clipped tones. By evening, the mood on the ship had shifted. The entertainment went on as planned, but there was an undercurrent of tension. People drank more, laughed louder, as if trying to drown out the unease. I found myself back on the upper deck, unable to shake the memory of the deckhand's distant voice. The sea was calm, the sky clear, but the night felt heavy. That's when I saw the lights. At first, I thought they were reflections, small faint orbs dancing on the water's surface, but as I watched, they grew brighter, more distinct. They moved against the waves, defying the rhythm of the sea, and they were heading straight for the ship. A voice broke the stillness. It wasn't loud, more like a whisper carried on the wind. But it was enough to make the hairs on my neck stand up. I couldn't make out the words, but there was a rhythm to it, like a chant or a song. I wasn't alone this time. A young woman, another passenger, had wandered onto the deck. She froze when she saw the lights, her hand gripping the railing. "Do you see that?" she asked, her voice trembling. I nodded. The lights stopped just short of the ship, hovering like fireflies caught in a net. The chanting grew louder, more insistent. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the lights vanished. The woman turned to me, her face pale. "What was that?" "I don't know," I said, "but I think it's time to go inside." The next morning, there was another announcement. A second crew member had gone missing. This time, the whispers among the passengers turned to panic. People demanded answers, but the crew seemed as baffled as we were. The ship's security cameras showed nothing unusual, just the crew members going about their duties, then disappearing as if they'd stepped into thin air. I tried to stay calm, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, waiting. That night, I couldn't sleep. The room felt stifling, the walls too close. I found myself back on the upper deck, drawn by some invisible thread. The sea was black and still, the stars reflected in its surface like scattered diamonds. And then I heard it again, the chanting. It was louder this time, more distinct. The words were still impossible to understand, but the tone was clear, pleading, mournful, accusing. The lights returned, circling the ship like a pack of wolves. I stood frozen, unable to look away, and then I saw them. Figures in the water just beneath the surface. Pale, ghostly forms that seemed to glow with an inner light. Their faces were blank, featureless, but I could feel their gaze, heavy and unrelenting. I don't know how long I stood there, staring into the water. When I finally tore my eyes away, the deck was empty. No lights, no figures. Just the endless, empty sea. The Ocean Whisperer docked in Naples a few days later, and I disembarked with the rest of the passengers. The missing crew members were never found. I don't know what happened to them or to the ship. I've told this story to a few people over the years, but most don't believe me. But I know what I saw, and sometimes when I'm near the water, I hear the chanting again. A distant echo, a reminder that the sea is never truly empty. Story number 3, by George. In 2019, I found myself in Venice, the city of canals, soaking up the history before embarking on a dream trip. A luxury cruise through the Adriatic and Aegean seas. I'd planned it as a way to unwind after a hectic few years, a promise to myself to embrace adventure. The ship, Elysian Dawn, was modern, sleek, and crowded with vacationers eager for sunsets and open seas. On the surface, everything seemed perfect. But I've always believed that even the most beautiful places have their shadows. I just didn't know how dark those shadows could get. The third night of the journey started normally enough. I was sitting in the lounge enjoying a whiskey when the ship's intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've encountered a minor technical issue. Please remain indoors while we resolve it. Thank you." I didn't think much of it. Ships were like floating cities. Things were bound to go wrong occasionally. But as the hours passed, the atmosphere shifted. The steady hum of the engines became uneven, almost like the ship was struggling against something. The lights flickered once, then twice. I brushed it off and decided to take a walk. The corridors were emptier than usual, the kind of quiet that makes you realize how alone you really are. That's when I heard the sound, a faint knocking. It was rhythmic, coming from behind one of the metal doors marked "Crew Only." I stopped and listened, straining to hear more. It wasn't loud, but it was deliberate. I knocked back lightly, almost without thinking. The knocking stopped. I told myself it was probably just a crew member on the other side working on repairs, but something about it felt off. The next morning, the ship's course changed. We were no longer heading to the next planned port, but toward a new set of coordinates. Most passengers didn't notice or didn't care, but I overheard a crew member whispering about a distress signal. At breakfast, I met Jonah, a British journalist who looked as uneasy as I felt. He introduced himself and got straight to the point. "You heard about the signal?" "What signal?" I asked. He leaned in, lowering his voice. "An SOS. It came through last night. Distress call from a ship. No name. just coordinates. That's not unusual, is it? It is when there's no record of a ship in the area, Jonah said. And when the signal cuts out before you can trace it. Something about his tone made me pause. Jonah wasn't the type to scare easily. Where are we heading now? I asked. To those coordinates, he said. By late afternoon, the mood on the ship had shifted. The usual buzz of activity had dulled, replaced by murmurs and darting glances. The sky grew darker, though it wasn't yet evening. I ran into Jonah again on the upper deck, staring out at the horizon with a grim expression. They're not telling us everything, he said. I spoke to one of the crew. This isn't the first time the Elysian Dawn has picked up a signal like this. What do you mean? 2 years ago, another crew reported the same thing. A distress call with no origin. They ignored it. The ship ran into trouble a few days later. No explanation. Before I could respond, the captain's voice boomed over the intercom. Attention all passengers, please return to your cabins immediately. Jonah and I exchanged a look. Something was happening. That night I couldn't sleep. The ship was eerily quiet, save for the occasional groan of metal. Around midnight I heard it again, the knocking. This time it was louder, more insistent. It came from the floor below, where the crew quarters and storage areas were located. My curiosity got the better of me. I slipped out of my cabin, careful not to wake anyone, and followed the sound. The lower deck was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of salt and oil. I walked cautiously, my footsteps echoing against the metal walls. The knocking led me to a door marked mechanical access, restricted. I pressed my ear against the door. Please, open. The voice was faint, muffled, but unmistakable. I froze. It was a man's voice, trembling, desperate. Hello? I called out. No response. I should have turned back. I should have walked away. But something compelled me to push the door open. The room beyond was cramped and cluttered with machinery. At first glance, it seemed empty. But then I saw it. Scratch marks on the metal floor, leading to a large ventilation grate. I moved closer, heart pounding. The grate was bolted shut, but something about it felt wrong, like it didn't belong there. That's when I saw the dried blood on the edges. The next morning, the ship slowed to a stop. The captain announced that we'd reached the coordinates but gave no further explanation. I joined a small group of passengers on the deck, all craning their necks to see what was out there. The water was calm, unnaturally so, and there was nothing in sight. No other ships, no debris, just an empty horizon. But Jonah noticed something. Look, he said, pointing to the water. At first I didn't see it, but then I caught the faint outline of something just below the surface. A shadow, large and motionless. Is that a ship? I asked. Before Jonah could answer, the engines roared back to life. The Elysian Dawn began to move, leaving the shadow behind. Jonah and I confronted the captain later that day. He was reluctant to talk, but eventually admitted the truth. There have been rumors about this area, he said. Unmarked wrecks, distress signals with no source, ships that disappear without a trace. We don't stop here. Not ever. Then why did you bring us here? Jonah demanded. We didn't have a choice, the captain said, his voice heavy. The signal. It overrides everything. Once you receive it, you're compelled to follow. The rest of the trip passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd narrowly escaped something we couldn't understand. Jonah and I parted ways at the next port, but we stayed in touch. A few months later, he sent me an article. It was about the Elysian Dawn. The ship had gone missing during its next voyage along the same route we'd taken. I don't know what's out there in the Adriatic, but I know this. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some calls for help are meant to be ignored. Story number 4, by Lucas. They say the sea has two faces, one of calm beauty, the other of merciless depth. I never believed that until I saw it for myself. This is a story not of ghosts or monsters, but of the way the ocean holds on to secrets, offering them only to those foolish enough to venture too close. In the summer of 2016, I found myself aboard the Eclipse Serenade, a grand cruise liner cutting through the Mediterranean on a week-long journey. I wasn't looking for anything more than a relaxing escape. Athens to Santorini, then Crete, Rhodes, and back. 7 days of indulgence, surrounded by sunlit waves and strangers who would soon feel like old friends. The ship was magnificent, all polished metal and glass, a floating city that promised every comfort. I spent the first 2 days just soaking it in. The food, the music, the endless horizon. It felt like nothing could touch us out there, suspended between sky and sea. But then, on the 3rd day, the tide shifted. We were somewhere between Santorini and Crete when the announcement came. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've received a distress signal and are diverting to investigate. Please remain calm and enjoy your day. A ripple of murmurs spread through the passengers. A distress signal? Out here? The Mediterranean wasn't exactly the wild Atlantic. It felt odd. Still, most of us didn't think much of it. Ships help other ships. That's just how it works. I was on the upper deck, nursing a coffee and watching the waves when Jonah appeared. He was a wiry Brit with a quick wit and a tendency to stick his nose into everything. "You hear about the SOS?" he asked, dropping into the chair beside me. "Yeah," I said, shrugging. "Probably just a fishing boat or something." Jonah leaned in, lowering his voice. "Word is it's not a modern signal. Apparently it came from an older system, one that hasn't been in use for decades." That caught my attention. "How's that possible? Don't ships all use satellites now?" "You'd think," Jonah said, pulling out his phone to check our location. "But this part of the Med's tricky. A lot of wrecks out here. Some say it's cursed." I laughed, though it sounded hollow even to me. "Cursed? That's a bit dramatic." Jonah grinned. "Maybe. But you've heard of the Oranos, right?" I hadn't. He explained that the Oranos was a cargo ship that disappeared in these waters in the 1970s. No distress call, no debris, just gone. Stories like that always felt like urban legends, but the way Jonah told it, there was something unsettling about the ease with which the sea could erase something so massive. By late afternoon, we'd arrived at the coordinates. The Eclipse Serenade slowed to a crawl, its engines humming softly as it came to a stop. A crowd gathered at the railings, all eyes scanning the water for signs of another ship. But there was nothing. The sea stretched out endlessly, calm and indifferent. No debris, no lifeboats, no sign of distress. "Maybe it sank," someone muttered nearby. Jonah, standing beside me, shook his head. "If it sank, there'd still be something, an oil-slick floating cargo. This is strange." The captain made another announcement, his voice tighter this time. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are conducting a search in response to the signal. Please remain patient and stay on the main decks." That's when we noticed the smaller lifeboats being lowered into the water. A team of crew members climbed in, armed with searchlights and radios, and set off toward the horizon. As night fell, the ship remained eerily still. Passengers grew restless, pacing the decks and whispering in hushed tones. The usual chatter and laughter were gone, replaced by an uneasy silence. I stayed up late, leaning against the railing and staring out at the black water. Jonah joined me, a flask of whiskey in hand. "Why haven't they found anything?" I asked. "Because there's nothing to find," he said flatly. "Whatever sent that signal isn't here anymore." I frowned. "You think it sank?" Jonah took a long sip before answering. "Maybe. Or maybe it never existed at all." The next morning, the Eclipse Serenade was moving again. The captain announced that the search had been called off and that we were resuming our journey to Crete. The tone of his voice made it clear he didn't want questions. But questions were all anyone had. At breakfast, a couple I'd met earlier told me they'd overheard a crew member saying the signal had stopped abruptly, as if someone had cut the line. Another passenger claimed to have seen something in the water, a faint shape too large to be a dolphin or shark moving just beneath the surface. Jonah and I decided to do some investigating of our own. We roamed the lower decks, trying to catch snippets of conversation from the crew. Most of them avoided eye contact, brushing off our questions with polite smiles. But one young crewman, clearly shaken, let something slip. "It wasn't a modern signal," he whispered. "It came from a system that shouldn't even be operational anymore. And the coordinates, they match an old wreck site." Jonah pressed him for more, but he clammed up and walked away. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my cabin, staring at the ceiling, the hum of the ship's engines vibrating through the walls. Around midnight, I decided to take a walk. The halls were deserted, the usual buzz of activity replaced by an oppressive stillness. As I made my way to the deck, I heard something. A faint tapping, like metal against metal. I followed the sound, my footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. It led me to a door marked "Crew Only." The tapping stopped as I approached, replaced by a low, muffled voice. "Help!" I froze. The voice was faint, barely audible, but it was there. "Hello?" I called out. Silence. I should have turned back, but curiosity pushed me to open the door. The room beyond was a storage area, dimly lit and cluttered with equipment. At first glance, it seemed empty. But then I noticed something strange. Wet footprints leading toward a metal hatch. I stepped closer, heart pounding. The hatch was slightly ajar, water dripping from its edges. I pulled it open and peered inside, but it was too dark to see anything. The air was thick with the smell of salt and rust. And then I heard it again. The voice. "Help me." It was coming from below. I don't remember running back to my cabin, but I must have. The next morning, I told Jonah what had happened. He listened intently, his usual smirk replaced by a look of concern. "You're sure it wasn't just a crew member messing with you?" he asked. I shook my head. It didn't feel normal. There was something wrong about it. Jonah was quiet for a moment before speaking. "You know the wreck the crewman mentioned? I looked it up. It's an old passenger ship, the Aegean Mariner. Sank in the 70s after sending out a distress signal. No survivors." I stared at him, chills running down my spine. "And those were the coordinates we went to?" He nodded. The rest of the trip was uneventful, but the sense of unease lingered. When we docked back in Athens, I was relieved to step onto solid ground, but the sea had left its mark on me. I don't know what I heard that night, or what sent that signal. Maybe it was just the echo of the past, the remnants of a tragedy that the sea couldn't fully swallow. Or maybe the ocean holds more than we can ever understand. All I know is this: the sea is a mirror, but it doesn't just reflect what's on the surface. Sometimes it shows you what lies beneath. Story number 5 by Oliver. The sea isn't like anything you expect. The more you're out there, the more you realize how small and insignificant you are. You could disappear without a trace, swallowed whole by the endless waves. And that's exactly what happened on the Aurora Star. I was supposed to be on vacation, just a simple getaway to escape work, bills, and life in general. My friend Luke invited me along at the last minute, and I figured, why not? It was a week-long cruise along the coast of Alaska, something to break up the routine. Luke was one of those guys who had an answer for everything. The guy who never stops talking but makes you laugh even when you want to scream. I needed a break from my own quiet world, and I figured he'd keep things light. But I had no idea how wrong I was. The first couple of days were perfect. The Aurora Star was a mid-sized cruise ship, not as luxurious as some of the giants you see on TV, but nice enough. The passengers were a mixed bag: families, older couples, solo travelers, and most were content to relax and enjoy the views of glaciers and jagged cliffs that seemed to come out of nowhere. Luke and I spent the days soaking up the sights, hitting up the bars, and pretending we weren't totally out of shape. In the evenings, we'd grab dinner with a couple of people we met on board: Megan and Ryan, a married couple from Colorado, and Alice, a friendly, chatty woman in her 40s who was traveling solo after her kids moved out of the house. We got along fine. The days blended into one long vacation haze of good food, laughs, and sunshine. But all that changed when we hit day 3. It started out like any other day, with the usual morning announcements over the loudspeakers, weather reports, trivia contests, spa specials. But around midday, something felt off. We docked at a smaller port to let passengers explore the nearby hiking trails. When we got back to the ship, there was a quiet, almost uneasy vibe. The crew was moving around more quickly than usual, glancing over their shoulders like something was going on. Megan and Ryan weren't at dinner that night. I figured they were just tired, maybe off doing something else, but Luke noticed it too. "That's weird, right?" he asked. "They're always the first ones to show up for food." I shrugged. trying to keep things light. Probably just exploring or sleeping in. But when I asked around, no one seemed to have seen them all day. Alice, the solo traveler, said she'd seen Megan near the pool earlier, but that was it. That night, the ship's captain made an announcement. "We've had a minor situation with a few passengers," he said, his voice calm but strained. "Nothing to worry about, but we ask that everyone stays on board for the next few hours while we sort things out." Luke and I exchanged a look. By morning, Megan, Ryan, and Alice were still nowhere to be found. The captain made another announcement, this time with more urgency, but still downplaying the situation. "Everything is under control," he said. "Please enjoy your day as scheduled." But it wasn't under control. The air felt thicker now, like something was hanging over us. Luke was getting more suspicious. "This doesn't feel right, man," he said. "Something's going on, and I'm not buying whatever they're trying to sell." We started poking around, asking the crew if they knew anything more, but no one was willing to talk. The ship's staff just kept saying everything was fine, but their eyes told a different story. That evening, things took a turn. A storm hit the ship, unexpectedly, or at least that's what we were told. The weather forecast had been fine, so no one saw it coming. The waves slammed against the ship, making the Aurora Star pitch and groan. I was trying to enjoy the last bit of normalcy by grabbing a drink in the lounge, but the ship was rocking harder now. I could hear the sounds of plates and glasses crashing from the dining room as things started to fall apart. "Is it just me or is this getting worse?" Luke asked. Before I could answer, we heard shouting from down the hall. A group of passengers were gathered near the stairs, looking frantic. "What's happening?" someone asked, but no one had a clear answer. The lights flickered, then they went out completely. When the lights came back on, everything had changed. The ship's PA system crackled to life, and the captain's voice was strained. "We've had some technical difficulties. Please remain calm and stay in your cabins." But there was no calm. The noise in the hallways was growing louder now. Running footsteps, shouting, and the unmistakable sound of people in a panic. "What the hell is going on?" I muttered. Luke grabbed my arm. "Let's go. We need to check this out." We moved down the hallway toward the noise, but halfway there, a crew member stopped us. "You need to stay in your room," he said firmly. "It's for your own safety." "Safety from what?" Luke asked, his voice sharp. The crew member hesitated, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "Just stay inside, okay?" We returned to our cabin, but we couldn't just sit there. Something felt off, like a bad dream you can't wake up from. The storm outside raged on, and the ship kept creaking like it might fall apart at any second. I couldn't help but notice how quiet it had gotten. No more people in the halls. No more chatter. Around 2 a.m., there was a knock on our door. I froze. Luke got up cautiously and opened it a crack. Standing there was Megan, her face pale and her eyes wide. "We need to get off this ship," she said, her voice shaking. "What happened to you?" "Where's Ryan?" I asked. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked over her shoulder, her eyes darting nervously down the hallway. "I don't know where he is. I woke up and he was gone. But there's something wrong with the lower decks." Luke stepped forward, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean something wrong? What are you talking about?" She took a deep breath. "It's not just the storm. People are disappearing. I went down to check on Ryan, but the lower decks, there's something down there. I don't know what it is, but it's bad." By morning, the Aurora Star was docked in Juneau, Alaska. The crew made no mention of what had happened. There were no official reports, and the passengers who'd been missing, Ryan, Alice, Megan's husband, were never found. The captain issued a brief statement claiming it had all been a misunderstanding and assured everyone that the ship was safe to continue its journey. But no one on board felt safe anymore. Luke and I left the ship as soon as we could. We didn't even bother with the return trip, we just booked the first flight home. I don't know what happened on that ship. Maybe it was just a freak accident. Maybe it was something else. But I'll never forget that feeling of being trapped alone, out in the middle of nowhere with nothing but a ship full of secrets and an ocean that doesn't care. Made it back to shore, barely, huh? These stories are proof that even paradise has its shadows. If you're into feeling those chills creep up your spine, go ahead and smash that subscribe button and join the crew. We're just getting started. Until next time, sleep tight and maybe stay off the water.